I was drowning. Not literally, but it felt like it. The slow, suffocating kind of drowning where every breath is a struggle, where the weight of your own failures drags you deeper into the void. Jobless for 6 months, my savings nearly gone, my phone silent except for bills and rejection notices. The apartment I barely paid for was a coffin of loneliness, walls closing in with every passing day. Friends had stopped calling after the third "I'm still looking," and family, while sympathetic, offered no answers, just empty reassurances that didn't reach my ears. I needed to escape. I needed a lifeline. Anything that could pull me out of this pit before I disappeared completely. The flyer I found was that lifeline. Night truck driver needed. Remote northern Maine route. Good pay. The words were simple, but for me they were a beacon. The catch? Strange hours. Stranger rules. A route locals avoided like the plague. Perfect. I was desperate enough to take it without question. On my first day, the foreman handed me a sheet of rules. I unfolded it, fingers trembling slightly, the paper crackling in the quiet office. At first, they looked like nonsense, too strict, almost paranoid. But as I read each line, a creeping unease settled in my stomach. Delivery protocol. Read carefully and follow without exception. Rule number 1. Begin your route precisely at midnight. No early starts, no delays. Time here is more than a schedule. It's a boundary between worlds. Rule number 2. Complete all deliveries before 4 a.m. Return to base immediately if behind schedule. The hollow hours aren't forgiving. Rule number 3. Follow the designated route exactly. No detours, no shortcuts. Every inch of this path has a purpose. Rule number 4. Do not stop for hitchhikers or unknown persons. No exceptions. Rule number 5. Do not make eye contact with anyone approaching during deliveries. Lock your doors and leave immediately if it's not your intended recipient. Rule number 6. Only exit your vehicle at approved delivery points after confirming the signal. Flash your headlights 3 times and wait for 2 flashes in return. Communication is ritual, not chance. Rule number 7. Ignore any voices calling your name, from the radio, the woods, or anywhere else. Do not respond or look toward them. They do not speak your language. They speak your fears. Rule number 8. If your radio turns on by itself once or twice, turn it off immediately. If it turns on a 3rd time, abandon your route and return to base. Technology is not always your friend out here. Rule number 9. Never invite anyone into your vehicle or personal space during deliveries. This is your sanctuary. Keep it sacred. Rule number 10. Trust the rules. Your life depends on it. I folded the paper with care, the weight of those words pressing down on me like the night itself. The foreman's eyes lingered on me, his expression unreadable. "You'll need those rules more than you know," he said softly. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. The rig was an aging freightliner, a beast of steel and diesel that smelled of oil and exhaust but promised reliability. I climbed in, the worn leather seat creaking beneath me. The night outside was cold and thick with fog that hugged the ground and wrapped the trees like a shroud. It blurred the edges of the world until only the pale ribbon of Route 89 remained clear beneath my headlights. My breath came out in visible puffs as I cracked the window just a fraction, the chill seeping in. The cab's heater struggled to fight the cold, but it was more than the temperature that chilled me. I pulled out my manifest, a sheet of addresses and numbered crates that made no sense to me. No names, no contact numbers, only symbols and coordinates that pointed into the deep wilderness. At exactly midnight, the dashboard clock glowed green. I shifted into gear, the engine growling like a wild animal awakening from slumber. The tires hummed on the asphalt, the steady beat a small comfort against the growing silence. The first stop appeared almost suddenly, a small farmhouse tucked behind a copse of pines, its windows dark except for a faint porch light flickering weakly. I eased the truck to a stop, heart thudding in rhythm with the engine. Following protocol, I flashed my headlights 3 times. 1, 2, 3, then waited. The porch light blinked twice in response. The ritual felt ancient, like a secret handshake between shadows. I grabbed the crate marked number 1, the wood rough beneath my gloves, and placed it on the stoop. The night air smelled of pine sap and earth, crisp and cold against my skin. No footsteps came. No door creaked open. I hesitated only a moment before climbing back into the cab, locking the doors with a sharp click. The quiet outside seemed thicker somehow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The road ahead disappeared into a fog so dense I could barely see the edges of the asphalt. The radio crackled softly, static whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. I pulled up to the second stop, an abandoned warehouse, paint peeling, windows boarded. No lights, no signs of life. I repeated the signal, 3 flashes of the headlights. No response. The rules were clear. If there was no answer, move on. Still, a shiver ran down my spine as I pulled away. The radio hissed, then a whisper. My name. I slammed the radio off. Silence. But the silence wasn't empty. There's a stillness out here that isn't quiet. It's waiting. The fog closed in, and the night deepened. The miles passed slowly, each one heavier than the last. The third stop was a Victorian house that looked like it had been swallowed by time. The porch sagged, shadows pooling beneath cracked windows. I flashed the headlights, waited for the signal. 2 flashes. I grabbed crate number 3 and placed it on the steps. Then I saw it, a figure in the edge of the porch, too tall, too thin. Movements jerky and unnatural. Rule number 5 screamed in my mind, lock your doors, leave immediately. I didn't look back. Back in the cab, I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away, the figure fading into the fog behind me. My heart thundered, breath shallow, the night was alive, and it was watching. The road behind me disappeared into the swirling fog like a swallowed secret. The world beyond my windshield reduced to a narrow corridor of faded yellow lines and towering shadows. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, though my pulse hammered against my ribs like a warning drum. The radio sat silent, its usual crackle replaced by a heavy stillness that pressed against my ears. I glanced again at the rules folded in my jacket pocket, their words etched into my mind like a lifeline. The air inside the cab was cold, stale. The heater's warmth no match for the creeping chill that seemed to seep through the metal and into my bones. The next delivery was miles ahead, deeper into the wilderness where even the GPS flickered uncertainly, as if the earth itself resisted being mapped. The trees crowded the road there, their twisted limbs reaching like grasping fingers, and the fog thickened until the headlights barely cut through it. When I pulled up to the 4th stop, a weathered cabin perched at the edge of a frozen lake, I could barely make out the porch light blinking weakly through the mist. I checked my watch. 1:45 a.m. Plenty of time, yet every second felt stretched thin, heavy with unseen eyes. 3 flashes from my headlights, then I waited. 2 flashes back. The signal. I grabbed crate number 4, the wood rough and cold, and set it carefully on the porch. No footsteps stirred, no voices answered. Rule number 6 played in my mind. Only exit the vehicle after confirming the signal. The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the crunch of gravel under my boots as I hurried back to the truck. My breath came in sharp gasps, misting in the cold air. Back inside, I locked the doors, the click like a shield snapping shut. The radio hissed briefly to life, and for a moment, static filled the cab. Then, a voice. Software familiar. James. My name? Drawn out slow and low, a whisper curling from the static like smoke. Rule number 7 screamed through my thoughts. Ignore any voices calling your name. Do not respond or look. I slammed the radio off, fingers trembling. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. The miles ahead twisted through dense forest, the road barely a thread beneath my tires. Every shadow seemed to shift and breathe, watching. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught something. A figure standing still beneath the skeletal branches, tall and thin, limbs bent at impossible angles. I froze. The hairs on my arms stood straight. Rule number 5 was clear. Do not make eye contact, lock your doors, and leave immediately. I obeyed without hesitation, throwing the truck into gear and racing away, the figure fading into the fog behind me. My heart pounded, breath ragged. I wasn't just delivering packages anymore, I was delivering my own sanity. The night was far from over. The weight of the night pressed down harder with every mile. The fog thickened like a living thing, curling around the truck, muffling the world outside until the only sounds were the steady thrum of the engine and the occasional creak of the cab settling. My breath fogged the cracked window as I wiped it away with the back of my glove. But no matter how much heat I pumped into the cab, the chill in my bones remained. The rules lay folded in my jacket pocket, a constant reminder that this was no ordinary delivery route. Every instruction felt like a thread holding me together against whatever prowled just beyond the reach of the headlights. Rule number 3 haunted me. Follow the designated route exactly. No detours, no exceptions. But with the woods so dense, the road twisting like a serpent, it was hard not to feel like I was driving through a world that didn't want to be found. At the next stop, a dilapidated farmhouse whose windows stared out like dark, unblinking eyes, I killed the engine and checked my watch. 2:30 a.m. The hour felt like the darkest part of the night, a liminal space between yesterday and tomorrow, between the known and the unknown. 3 flashes of the headlights, 2 flashes from the porch light. The ritual was a fragile bridge between me and the world beyond. I grabbed crate number 5, its surface rough with age, and left it on the porch. No footsteps, no door opening, just silence. I hurried back inside, locking the doors with trembling hands. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something. Something tall and pale standing just at the edge of the tree line. But when I blinked, there was nothing. Rule number 4 repeated itself in my mind. Do not stop for hitchhikers or unknown persons. No exceptions. The radio crackled, static rising and falling like a tide. Then a voice, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. James. My name again carried on the hiss of the static. I slammed the radio off. The cab plunged back into uneasy silence. Every instinct screamed at me to speed up, to get off this road, to escape the weight of unseen eyes. But the clock was ticking. Deliveries had to be done before 4 a.m. Or the rule said I had to turn back. I pressed on. The woods seemed to close in tighter with every turn, the trees twisting into impossible shapes, limbs reaching like skeletal hands. The road ahead was no longer just a path. It was a gauntlet, and I was running out of time. The silence in the cab was heavier than before, weighed down by the fog that pressed like a wet blanket against the windows. The trees outside swayed gently in the cold breeze, their skeletal branches scraping against one another like distant whispers in a language I couldn't understand. My eyes flicked repeatedly between the cracked yellow line on the road and the rearview mirror, hoping to find some reassurance in the emptiness behind me. But the darkness seemed to breathe, shifting and alive. The next delivery was at a cabin nestled deep in the forest, where the road narrowed to a barely visible dirt track, its edges swallowed by thick moss and tangled roots. As I slowed the truck, the headlights caught something glinting among the trees, pale, almost translucent, moving with unnatural grace. I shook my head, telling myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by moonlight struggling through the mist, but my heart hammered louder, each beat a warning. Rule number 5. Do not make eye contact with anyone approaching during deliveries. Lock your doors and leave immediately. The porch light flickered and I flashed my headlights 3 times. A faint, hesitant response of 2 flashes came back. I grabbed crate number 6 and set it down carefully, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, but beneath it was something else. A faint metallic tang, sharp and cold. I hesitated as a soft rustling came from the woods. Something was moving just beyond the trees. I turned sharply, catching a glimpse of a figure. Tall, slender, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its face obscured by shadows that seemed to ripple and shift like smoke. A chill ran down my spine. Without looking directly, I slipped back into the cab, locking the door. The engine roared to life, tires crunching gravel as I sped away, heart pounding in my ears. The radio crackled to life once more, but before I could react, it cut out again, plunging the cab into a heavy silence. The clock was nearing 3:30 a.m., the end of my route approaching. But the tension was far from easing. Every shadow felt like a pair of eyes watching, waiting. The road was no longer just a path through the woods. It was a boundary I was crossing, a line I wasn't meant to step over. And whatever was out there in the mist and dark knew my name. The road narrowed, twisting sharply through a dense stand of ancient pines, whose branches clawed at the sky, blotting out the stars. The fog thickened to the point where the edges of my headlights blurred into a swirling gray haze. It felt like I was driving through a dream or a nightmare, where reality shifted just out of reach. My breath came ragged and uneven, misting inside the cab as I focused on the cracked yellow lines slipping beneath the tires. The rules echoed in my mind like a mantra. Rule number 3. Follow the designated route exactly. No detours, no exceptions. This road was my lifeline. The final stop was a cabin perched precariously at the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by the gnarled roots of towering trees. The porch light flickered weakly, barely cutting through the thick fog. My fingers trembled as I reached for the headlight switch, 3 flashes, waiting for the 2-blink response. The signal came, faint and hesitant. I grabbed crate number 7, its wood cold and rough against my gloves, and set it down gently on the porch. A silence fell, so deep it seemed to press against my chest. Then, from the shadows beyond the porch, movement. Slow, deliberate, too deliberate. I caught a glimpse of something, tall, impossibly thin, limbs bent at unnatural angles, its face a shifting blur of smoke and shadow. A voice, soft and coaxing, slipped through the stillness. "Come with us." My heart hammered as my breath caught. Rule number 7 screamed in my mind. Ignore any voices calling your name. Do not respond or look." I didn't. I fled back to the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it tight. The engine roared as I sped away, tires skidding on loose gravel. The figure lingered at the edge of the fog, watching, waiting. The radio sputtered once, twice, then fell silent. As I drove back into the encroaching darkness, I realized the road wasn't just a path through the forest. It was a boundary between worlds, and I was trapped in the crossing. The return trip felt endless, the rig's engine a low growl beneath my tense grip on the wheel. The fog clung to the trees like a shroud, and every mile felt heavier, like the weight of unseen eyes bore down on me. My mind replayed every moment of the night. The silent houses, the flickering porch lights, the impossible shapes lurking just beyond the headlights' reach. My thoughts drifted to the rules, especially rule number 10. Trust the rules. Your life depends on it. But as the minutes passed, I wondered if the rules were enough. The radio crackled again, briefly, then went silent. I didn't touch the switch. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye in the rearview mirror. Pale, elongated limbs slinking just beyond the fog's edge. I blinked, and it was gone. A cold sweat broke across my forehead. I swallowed hard and tried to steady my breathing. The night was no longer just a stretch of road. It was a battleground, and I was the unwitting sentinel. I thought about the life I'd left behind. The joblessness, the loneliness, the crushing weight of regret. Somehow that pain had led me here to this cursed route, where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. I reached the farm where my shift had begun. The faint glow of a porch light greeted me, and I pulled the truck into its usual spot. The foreman was waiting, his weathered face unreadable as I climbed down from the cab. "You followed the protocol," he said quietly. "That's all anyone can ask." I nodded, but the words felt hollow. I was marked now, marked by the night, by the things I'd seen, and by the rules I'd barely begun to understand. The job was far from over. The next days crawled by in a haze of restless sleep and endless questions. My mind refused to quiet itself, replaying the shadows that haunted those deliveries and the whisper of a voice that wasn't quite human. The rules felt like both a lifeline and a prison, strict and unforgiving, but the only thing standing between me and whatever waited in the dark. I found myself wandering through the small town near the route during the daylight hours, seeking fragments of answers from the few locals brave enough to talk. Their eyes flickered with something I couldn't place, fear or maybe resignation. They spoke in hushed tones about the woods, about things that slipped between worlds, about warnings handed down like sacred secrets. One elderly man named Walter told me about the hollow hours, the time between midnight and 4 a.m., when the veil between worlds thinned and shadows walked among us. He spoke of ancient pacts, rituals, and protectors tasked with maintaining the boundary. His words sent chills deeper than the night air ever could. Each story I heard only tangled the threads of mystery tighter. The line between superstition and reality blurred until I wasn't sure which side I stood on. Every night, as the clock neared midnight, I prepared myself, rechecking the rules, double-checking the crates, steeling my nerves for the journey into the dark. The truck became both sanctuary and cage, the only thing between me and the waiting unknown. But the weight of silence was crushing. The forest didn't just watch, it whispered, beckoned, threatened. And I knew, deep down, that I was no longer just a driver. I was part of something much larger, much darker. Night fell quickly, swallowing the daylight and dragging with it the cold silence that had become all too familiar. I climbed into the cab of the truck, the worn leather seat feeling less like comfort and more like a reminder of everything I'd left behind. The folded rules lay next to me, a constant presence that whispered of unseen dangers and fragile boundaries. As the clock edged toward midnight, the engine rumbled to life beneath my hands. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, each mile bringing me closer to the unknown, closer to whatever watched from the shadows just beyond the reach of my headlights. The first few stops passed in a tense rhythm of flashing headlights and fleeting porch lights. No voices, no figures, just the thick, suffocating fog and the steady beat of my own heartbeat. But as I rounded a bend near the halfway point of my route, something changed. The radio crackled to life on its own, the static shifted into a distorted melody that set my teeth on edge. I fumbled for the power button, remembering rule number 8, turn it off immediately. The melody twisted into a whisper, calling my name again. James! I slammed the radio off. The cab plunged back into silence. Then, from the fog, emerged a figure. Not tall, not thin, but impossibly close. Its eyes were dark pools that reflected nothing, and its mouth stretched into a smile that didn't reach its cold, lifeless gaze. Rule number 5, do not make eye contact. But something in me wanted to look. Something in me wanted to understand. Instead, I forced my eyes to the road, heart hammering in my chest. I knew then that this was no longer just a job. This was a trial. And the shadows among us were watching. The fog grew thicker as I pressed onward, swallowing the road and muffling the world beyond my headlights. My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, every nerve ending alive with a quiet, insistent dread. The silence in the cab was oppressive, broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the soft crunch of gravel beneath the tires. The rules were my only anchor in this drifting sea of shadows. Rule number 1, begin the route precisely at midnight. Rule number 10, trust the rules. Your life depends on it. I clung to them like a lifeline, but doubt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. At the next stop, a lonely cabin hidden among ancient pines. The porch light blinked twice in response to my signal. I placed the crate carefully on the steps, every muscle tense, every sound amplified in the stillness. No sign of life stirred, no footsteps echoed. As I turned back to the truck, a whisper floated through the fog. Soft, urgent, impossible to ignore. James! I froze, breath caught in my throat. Rule number 7 hammered in my mind. Ignore any voices calling your name. Do not respond or look. But my eyes betrayed me, darting to the edge of the woods where shadows shifted like living things. A figure emerged, tall, pale, limbs bending at unnatural angles, its face a shifting blur that made my skin crawl. I climbed into the cab, locking the doors with trembling hands, the engine roaring to life as I sped away. The figure's eyes seemed to follow me, dark and unblinking, a silent promise of things yet to come. The road stretched before me, a thin line between worlds, and I was trapped in the crossing. Exhaustion clung to me like a second skin as the final miles ticked away beneath my tires. The night had stretched endlessly, folding over itself in waves of fog, shadow, and silence. My hands ached from gripping the wheel, and the edges of my vision blurred with weariness, but I couldn't let go. Not now. Not when the rules, those fragile threads of safety, were the only things holding me together. The radio crackled again, a spark of static that quickly bloomed into the haunting whisper of my name. James, it breathed, soft and coaxing. I slammed the power off, heart hammering so fiercely I was sure it would burst through my ribs. The forest pressed closer with every curve, the trees reaching out like skeletal fingers trying to pull me into their cold embrace. The headlights barely cut through the mist, and the darkness seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Then, at the edge of my vision, a movement. A figure stepped from the fog. Tall, impossibly thin, limbs twisting at unnatural angles. Its face was a shifting mass of shadows, features melting and reforming like smoke. It wore a smile that chilled me deeper than the night air. Rule number 5 screamed in my mind, do not make eye contact. Lock your doors, leave immediately. But my eyes met those hollow depths, and for a terrifying moment, I felt the line between hunter and prey blur. I slammed the accelerator, the engine roaring in defiance as the figure faded into the mist behind me. As the farm's porch light finally came into view, a cold sweat dripped down my back. I was alive, but marked. The night had changed me. The rules were no longer just survival. They were a beginning. The porch light of the farmhouse flickered weakly as I pulled in, the familiar sight a fragile comfort after the endless shadows. My hands trembled as I killed the engine, every nerve raw from the night's relentless tension. The air inside the cab was stale and cold, but the chill in my bones ran deeper than any winter breeze. I folded the worn sheet of rules again, the edges soft from repeated handling. They felt less like instructions now and more like warnings carved into my very soul. The foreman was waiting on the porch, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. He didn't speak at first, just studied me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You followed the protocol," he said finally, voice low. "That's all we can ask." I nodded, swallowing hard, but his words felt hollow. I knew what he meant. I was marked. The night had seen me. The things lurking in those woods had taken notice. I thought about the whispering voices, the shifting figures, the rules that kept me tethered to safety but left no room for mistakes. I thought about the loneliness that had brought me here, and the nightmare that now clung to every mile of that road. The job was no longer just about delivering crates. It was about surviving a darkness older than the trees lining the highway. And I was only just beginning to understand what that meant. The days between runs were a fragile reprieve, but my mind never truly rested. The silence of the town during daylight hours was a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet of the night roads. I wandered the streets, searching for answers in the wary glances of locals in whispered stories shared behind closed doors. But no one spoke openly of what lurked beyond the tree line. An old woman named Evelyn, whose eyes held the weariness of decades, warned me gently, "This place isn't just woods and roads. It's a boundary, a line between what we know and what we fear. The things you've seen, they don't just vanish." Her words echoed the dread that had settled in my chest. The rules weren't just about survival, they were They were about keeping something contained, something ancient. I found myself poring over old maps and journals left behind by previous drivers, piecing together fragments of a history shrouded in secrecy. The deliveries weren't just packages, they were offerings, protections, rituals designed to keep the shadows at bay. And I was part of that ritual now. The weight of that truth pressed down on me, heavier than any guilt or fear. My life had changed. I was no longer just a man running from the past. I was a guardian, marked by grief and bound by duty. The next run loomed ahead, and with it, the cold certainty that the night would test me again. Night came quicker now, a relentless tide that swallowed the sun and dragged me back to the road. The rig's engine purred beneath me as I prepared for another journey into the shadows. The rules once again folded carefully in my jacket pocket, a fragile shield against the unknown. The townsfolk's whispers echoed in my mind as the clock ticked closer to midnight. They spoke of the hollow hours, a time when the veil between worlds thinned and the unseen crossed over to test the living. For me, these hours were no longer an abstract warning, but a reality etched into every mile of my route. As I pulled onto Route 89, the fog lay thick like a blanket, the headlights cutting narrow tunnels through the gray. The silence was heavier tonight, almost oppressive, broken only by the steady rhythm of tires on asphalt. Each stop became a ritual: 3 flashes, 2 responses, careful placement of the crates. No voices, no figures. Yet the feeling of being watched never faded. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches like fingers reaching out from the darkness. The radio remained silent, its usual crackle replaced by a void that swallowed the sound itself. But the night whispered in other ways, in the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the distant howl of a creature unseen. As I reached the halfway point, the fog thickened, and a figure materialized in the periphery of my vision. A silhouette too tall, too slender, limbs twisting at unnatural angles. I forced my eyes away, heart pounding in my chest. Rule number 5. Do not make eye contact. Lock your doors. Leave immediately. The night was no longer just a road. It was a boundary I was sworn to protect. And crossing it meant facing what lurked beyond. The night air grew colder as I drove deeper into the forest, the fog thickening into an almost tangible wall around me. The headlights carved a narrow path through the gloom, but beyond their reach, shadows writhed and twisted, alive with secrets I dared not name. The route took me to a clearing where the last delivery awaited. A small stone marker, weathered and ancient, half buried beneath moss and fallen leaves. The crate I carried was different, heavier, wrapped in layers of cloth and tied with crimson thread. I parked the truck and stepped out, the crunch of dead leaves underfoot echoing in the stillness. The silence pressed down like a weight, broken only by the distant call of an owl and the soft rustle of branches. Rule number 6 echoed in my mind. Only exit at approved delivery points after confirming the signal. I flashed my headlights 3 times. 2 sharp flashes answered. I approached the marker, placing the offering carefully in a hollow carved into the stone. My voice trembled as I recited the words etched into the sheet of rules. An ancient invocation, a plea for safe passage. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a faint glow pulsed from the marker, blue-green light spreading like veins into the surrounding forest. The air shimmered, and I felt a presence pressing in, close and watchful. From the edge of the clearing, figures emerged. Tall, slender shapes with limbs bent at impossible angles. Their faces were shadows, swirling darkness that seemed to absorb the light. They spoke without words, voices a chorus of whispers that filled the air and echoed inside my mind. "You carry the mark," one said, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. The boundary weakens, the veil thins, the old packs fray. I swallowed hard, heart pounding as the weight of their gaze settled on me. The night was no longer just a journey. It was a reckoning. The air around the clearing seemed to hum with an electric tension, the blue-green glow casting eerie shadows that danced like phantoms among the ancient trees. I stood frozen, every muscle taut as the figures watched me with those hollow, shifting faces, eyes that reflected no light, only darkness. "You carry the mark," the whispering chorus repeated, voices overlapping in a haunted melody that seeped into my bones. The boundary phrase and the old ways wane. Your grief fuels the breach. Grief. The word hit me like a punch, the weight of it pressing harder than the cold night air. It was why I was here, why I had taken this cursed job, why the past wouldn't let me go. The figures moved closer, limbs bending unnaturally as they circled the stone marker. Their presence was both terrifying and mesmerizing, like watching shadows dance on the edge of reality. Rule number 10 whispered in my mind. Trust the rules. Your life depends on it. I swallowed my fear and reached into my pocket, fingers brushing the folded sheet of rules, the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The offering in the hollow pulsed stronger, the light spreading outward in waves that seemed to push back the shadows. One figure stepped forward, its form shifting, coalescing into a face I knew. A fleeting glimpse of warmth before it dissolved back into darkness. "Remember," it said, voice like a fading echo. "The pact must be honored, the balance kept." As the glow from the marker faded, the figures receded into the forest, their whispers lingering like a fading song. I stood alone, heart pounding, knowing the night's journey was far from over. I collapsed back into the truck's worn seat, sweat cold against my skin, despite the chill creeping through the cab. The forest around me settled into silence, but my mind roared with the weight of what had just transpired. The figures, the glowing marker, their words, all etched into my memory like scars. The grief that had driven me here was no longer just a shadow in my past. It had become a mark on my very soul, a beacon that tied me to this ancient battle between worlds. The rules weren't just instructions anymore, they were a contract, a blood oath I could not break. Every step on this road was a step deeper into a responsibility I hadn't asked for but could never escape. As the first hints of dawn softened the horizon, I knew that with each run, the boundary thinned further. The shadows would grow bolder, the tests harder. But I was no longer just a man running from his past. I was a guardian now, marked by loss and bound by duty. And whatever waited in the dark was watching. The days that followed were heavy with a silence that screamed in my ears. Word spread quietly through the town about the new driver and the strange happenings on the route. One evening, as twilight bled into night, I was summoned to a gathering at an old barn on the outskirts. An ancient structure weathered by time but still standing firm like the resolve of those inside. Inside, a group of locals had gathered, faces etched with lines of worry and wisdom. They called themselves the Council, keepers of the boundary, the ancient pact between the living and the shadows. Their presence was both reassuring and unsettling, as if the weight of centuries bore down on the dusty rafters above us. They spoke in hushed tones of the thinning veil, of the breaches that had become more frequent. They told stories of ancestors who made solemn vows, rituals to keep the balance, and the rising darkness that threatened to unravel it all. I listened, absorbing every word, every warning. The grief I carried made me different, marked, but it also made me vital to their cause. I was no longer an outsider, but a sentinel on the front lines of a hidden war. As the council members shared their knowledge, I felt the weight of the responsibility settling over me like a second skin. The nights ahead would test not only my courage, but my very soul. The nights grew colder, the forest darker, and the whispers more frequent. Under the guidance of the council, I began preparing for what they called the Hollow, the most dangerous time when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. It was during these nights that the creatures I'd glimpsed in the fog grew bolder, testing the boundaries I was sworn to protect. In a small, dimly lit room in the back of the barn, I learned ancient rituals, chants in languages I couldn't understand, symbols etched into talismans, and the careful preparation of offerings meant to appease the restless shadows. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and smoke, the weight of centuries pressing down with every whispered prayer. I was taught to carry iron, a metal said to disrupt the creature's ability to shift forms, and to anoint my wrists and neck with salves made from rare plants grown in secret gardens tended by the oldest council members. Every precaution was a shield, every gesture a line of defense. As the Hollow approached, my nerves tightened like a drawn bowstring. The rules became more than guidelines. They were lifelines. Every step, every delivery was a thread in a fragile tapestry holding back a darkness that threatened to consume everything. The road ahead was no longer just a path through the woods. It was the front line of a war fought in shadows and silence. The hour of midnight arrived like a predator stalking its prey. The rig's engine thrummed beneath me, a steady pulse against the oppressive silence that blanketed the forest. I tightened my grip on the wheel, the iron talisman cool against my skin, a small comfort against the encroaching darkness. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling around the truck like a living thing, pressing against the glass and muffling the world outside. The headlights carved narrow tunnels through the gray, but beyond their reach, shadows shifted and writhed, entities that belonged to another realm. Each stop on the route was a ritual, a delicate dance performed with trembling hands and a steady heart. Flashing headlights 3 times, waiting for 2 flashes in response, and setting the crates gently on the designated spots. At one delivery, I paused as the radio crackled to life on its own. The static warbled into a whisper. My name carried on a breathless sigh. I forced myself to shut it off immediately, knowing that a third occurrence meant abandoning the route. But the whisper lingered in my mind, a reminder that the creatures weren't just watching. They were testing me. The forest around me was alive with sound. The rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, the faint, almost imperceptible breathing of something unseen. I pressed onward, every nerve screaming, every sense alert. The hollow hours had begun. The night stretched like a shadow without end as I made my final deliveries. The fog thickened, swirling around the truck like a living veil, and the forest seemed to close in tighter with every mile. The weight of the unseen pressed down on me, cold and relentless. At the last stop, an ancient stone marker stood half buried in moss and leaves. I stepped out carefully, the iron talisman warm against my skin, the salve on my wrists grounding me. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the world itself held its breath. I placed the final crate into the hollow carved deep into the stone and whispered the old invocation, the words foreign but powerful. The marker pulsed with a soft blue-green light that spread outward, weaving a protective web through the woods. From the shadows emerged the figures, tall, slender, shifting shapes that flickered between forms. Their faces were darkness itself, swirling and elusive. Yet there was a moment of peace, a fragile truce in the air. "You have honored the pact," they whispered, voices like the rustling of ancient leaves. The boundary holds. For now. As I returned to the truck, the forest seemed to sigh, the fog lifting slightly as dawn's pale light touched the horizon. The road back was quieter, the unseen watchers retreating into the shadows. I knew the nights ahead would be long and dangerous, the boundary fragile and tested. But I also knew I was no longer alone. Marked by grief, bound by duty, I was part of something greater, a guardian between worlds. And for the first time since this journey began, I felt the faintest flicker of hope.